Hi, welcome to Cash Up, a weekly show where we converse with amazing folks in DFIR. And today I'm so excited to be joined by Dr. Stephen Boyce. Stephen's a Senior Global Election Technology and Cybersecurity Advisor for the International Foundation for Electoral Systems and an adjunct professor in cybersecurity at Marymount University. In addition, Stephen has his own consulting firm, The Cyber Doctor. Prior to his current roles in nonprofit and academia sector, Stephen worked in both the private sector and law enforcement. He was a principal consultant at the Crypsis Group, now Unit 42 by Palo Alto Networks, where he served as a virtual CISO to a $2 billion multinational conglomerate, as well as the lead and coordinator on an investigation in response to the DarkSide ransomware. Stephen started his career with the Federal Bureau of Investigations, where he worked as an information technology specialist and forensics examiner working with the Computer Analysis Response Team CART, the International Operations Division IOD, the Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty MLAT Unit, and the Counterterrorism Division CTD. Stephen also worked as a Pathways Information Technology Specialist for the U.S. Department of State. Stephen recently earned his Doctorate of Science in Cybersecurity from Marymount University, where his dissertation was on assessing the human operating system, a quantitative study of demographics and general decision-making styles, GMDS, on digital native students' security behavior intentions, SEBIS. Wow. Dr. Boyce was selected to deliver the 2021 graduate commencement speech for Business Information Leadership and Technology class at Marymount University. He also earned his Master of Science in Cybersecurity and his Bachelor of Science in Information Technology from Marymount. Stephen's also a member of Upsilon Pi Epsilon, International Honor Society and Association for Computing Machinery. Stephen holds a variety of certifications, including, but not limited to, the Certified Information Security Manager, CISM, the National Domestic Communication Assistance Center, NDCAC's Mobile Device Instructor, Certified Celebrate Operator, CCO, the Magnet Certified Forensics Examiner, MCFE, and several GIAC certifications, including the GIAC Advanced Smartphone Forensics, GISF, the GIAC Certified Forensics Examiner, GCFE, and the GIAC Security Essential Certificate, GSEC. He also is the Federal Bureau of Investigations CART Digital Forensics Examiner, and many other certifications. Stephen's spoken at a multitude of conferences, including both the 2020 and 2021 Magnet Virtual Summits, speaking on topics from jailbreaking iOS devices for acquisition to the role of digital forensics in global elections. He's authored articles on topics such as the data security supply chain in the next COVID wave and more. Stephen's been recognized as a recipient of the Cyber Core Scholarship for Service from the National Science Foundation. He also finds ways to give back to the DFIR community as a member of the Board of Advisors for Cyber Sleuth Science Lab and as an academic governance committee member for the Cyber Investigation Analysis Standard Expression, or CASE. As well, he also gives back to society at large through his prior work with the American Legion Jersey Boys State, where he served as both a junior assistant counselor and on the technology committee. I am so lucky to have gotten to work with Stephen in quite a variety of capacities over the years, and I'm always impressed by his knowledge, leadership, and understanding of the larger picture. There's very few people who can take so many intricacies and understand them at the very detailed level and then extrapolate to the managerial level, see the big picture, and be able to put an operation together. It's such a pleasure to get to catch up with him today. And with that, Stephen. Hi, Stephen.
Hey, Jessica. How are you?
Fantastic. Such a pleasure to have you on today. Thank you so much for coming on. So you've had quite the career spanning federal law enforcement with the FBI, going into the private sector with your work at Unit 42 as a principal examiner and incident responder, being an academic, teaching and obtaining a doctorate, and now you work at this international nonprofit. How did you get here? What was this journey? Need your superhero origin.
It has been quite the journey, and a lot of people ask, how I got into DFIR and cybersecurity. And I really credit it, partially, to my mother, who was in the insurance world and grew up on Wall Street, if you will, was really a visionary at ICT or IT, if you will, and recognized my knowledge, skills, and abilities for getting around the controls or her limitations of my usage of computers.
So hacking?
Yeah, essentially. And I'll tell you a funny story. Once upon a time, she had taken the power cord to the modem at the time, or to the back when towers were a thing, and to limit my usage after school. And so I made really good friends with my librarian and asked them for an extra power cord, so that, again, they're just universal. And so she didn't necessarily think. And so this was kind of human hacking 101, if you will.
Absolutely. And so from there, that's amazing. I love the fact that your inspiration, you credit it to your mother. And had she not put these blockades in front of you, you wouldn't have had to adapt around them. And if there's something that I know from our past encounters, is that you are very good at figuring out how to do the things that other people say are a stop. Like, if there's one thing about you, you're so tenacious. And when somebody else says, nope, this is as far as you can go, you always go, maybe not. Maybe there's a way we can still get that done. And it's that ingenuity and that outside of the box thinking that I have always found so admirable in you. And yeah, and your ability to still work it with management, in that instance being your mother. Right? We still need to be able to talk to those in control and correctly demonstrate how our methods still work, and that is definitely something you excel at. So I'm super excited to have you here today, because there are some really cool things that you've been working on recently, both in what you're doing professionally as you've semi-migrated out of DFIR and applying it to new things, as well as the things that you just finished up your doctorate in April, and just delivered that commencement. Again, congratulations, Mazel Tov. Just so wonderful that you've done so well, and you are just incredible. But tell us about this dissertation. The title is A Quantitative Study of what is it? I had it before, so I'm going to just scroll back up to where I had it, because it is too much for me to memorize. But Assessing the Human Operating System, a quantitative study of demographics and general decision-making styles on digital native students' security, behavior, intentions. So, I mean, seriously, I want to know about the human operating system.
Yeah, I mean, I think as technologists, at its core, we're used to all of our traditional operating systems, right? We're talking about Linux or Mac OS or iOS and Android. And, that's all good and well, but ultimately humans created these operating systems. And so really getting down to the core of people, right? Looking at the way in which humans, specifically digital natives, which I'll touch on briefly, how they interact with technology, right? And really the impetus came of my time in the government, doing a lot of our mandatory trainings that we had to do. Just like in corporations, we have our InfoSec training, if you will. And I found that those trainings, just like most InfoSec computer-based trainings, were really geared toward digital immigrants. So people who didn't necessarily grow up with technology, they adapted to tech, they were alive, living life, going to school, going to work, and then boom, the technology boom came, right? They had to adapt, and so they're classified as digital immigrants, whereas digital natives relatively grew up with technology from a young age, and had, in cases more recently, they've had technology at their forefronts of their parents when they're in the womb. They come out, and a couple of years later they have a tablet and they're attached to it. And so digital natives are really the future of society, and looking at what are the security vulnerabilities that are unique to them. Digital immigrants per se weren't necessarily doing things like we're doing right now, right? Many of them they would have conversations in person, social networking, they maybe adapted to it, whereas digital natives actively utilize social media, even in a professional sense, like we do on LinkedIn. So that's
really, really fascinating to me, because, we're talking about generational differences. And from doing the OSINT for your bio, I have a guess on where you may be age-wise. I'm not going to disclose it, but I will say that I'm definitively a Gen Xer. I was born in the 70s. I'm
Yep.
pretty open about my age, and so I would say that I'm on that cusp, right? Like I was a digital immigrant, but in high school, right? So I did have a computer as a child, but it was the Commodore 64. It wasn't the world around me full of computing. And then when I got into the career world, right, I'm one of those people who my first jobs, I had beepers, right? It was before cell phones. So in my age gap, I think that in my age group, there is this mix. And I think you're right, because I feel like Gen Xers, we've developed a lot of this training that's currently out there. And we developed it as the techie people who were trying to change the security behaviors of our less techie colleagues who weren't the nerds in school, who didn't have that access, and maybe were in a baby boomer or other Gen Xers. And as millennials became adapted to that in their normal life, and then people like I think of my children who are preteens and teens now, they have had access to technology technically since birth. You talk about in the womb. I think about the electronic gadgets that I was using to track my children's development and growth in the womb, right?
Yeah.
Like we were using technology at that point. And so it's just really, really fascinating to go, are the security postures and training that we've developed as a society, because they were legacy and developed by the nerdy Gen Xers to facilitate Gen X and boomers, and then the millennials that came behind. Now, what does that do to the younger millennials and the Gen Z? Because millennials, they're as old as 40 now, by the way, the top of the millennials, they turned 40 this year. And so that is just, wow, like it's such a good concept, because I wouldn't have even contemplated that history. I love it. So give us the TLDR. To ensure that we are being those people who are a little more digital native. What do we do different for digital natives?
Yeah, I think really that, I think we're at a really crucial point in our society right now, where a lot of organizations are thinking about kind of the return to work, if you will, post-COVID. And when you think about digital natives, some digital natives may never work in a traditional office like you and I were accustomed to. Right. That's even, after COVID, right? And so there's a lot of different things to think about. Ultimately, I ran a survey, and for those of you who are familiar with the academic process, you have to go through what is known as the Institutional Review Board, or the IRB. And really, it was a process, right? Going through, getting the questions and getting all the disclaimers and informed consent and all that fun stuff. Ultimately,
removal of bias.
Yes.
I always like to call out removal of bias when we're talking about surveys, and that's something that the IRB ensures. Yes. Hopefully, in a good IRB.
Yes. And so ultimately, what I found is that digital natives, how they interact with information or consume information and data, news, is much different than digital immigrants, as well as their, certainly from a DFIR perspective, when we look at artifacts like screen time and things of that nature, the amount of time that they are using devices is just exponential. And so I think I actually just recently saw an article about adversaries targeting victims via social media. And again, this is something that is going to be extremely important as we talk about hardening and securing digital natives, given the amount of time that they spend on these platforms and things of that nature.
Well, it's interesting too, because I find in sometimes in just my colloquial experience with more digital natives is that they are more comfortable sharing their information and data in a digital format and are less risk averse or less concerned, and actually see the use of algorithms that are utilizing their data to feed them specified content as a plus, whereas some digital immigrants see it as an invasion of privacy because it's not something that they had grown up with. So I think that maybe does change the security posture. And a really interesting element now, and especially you must have felt this, or I did at least as well when I worked in government workspaces, is in government workspaces, you are in a multi-generational workspace. And how do we make security programs that are able to be good for both sets of people at the same time, that are interactive, that involve people, that they take away the learnings, and that they're able to create a posture. It's fascinating.
Yeah. I mean, the digital natives, you put a computer-based training or even a live training in front of them, and you tell them about a floppy disk, they're going to look at you like you have 3 heads, right?
Or you're talking about the save icon.
Right. And guess what? There's a lot of training still out there in the wild today being implemented that says things like this. So.
Well, and that's because it costs money to develop training, right? So there is cost analysis, there's ROI, it is a very fascinating topic. So you are now working on things that are very leading cutting edge to get away from your dissertation. A little birdie tells me that in your work, in terms of doing election security, that you've been examining internet voting. Would you mind sharing a little bit about, the future there?
Yeah, absolutely. Internet voting has been around for a long time. And I think in the last 3 to 4 years, we've certainly, especially this last year with COVID, we've heard a little bit more of this. But thankfully, the researchers and academics around the world have been looking at this, implementing it at a small scale, which I'll touch on. And I've been, specifically in my role, looking at international implementations of internet voting. And ironically enough, I learned in my work overseas that here in the United States as well, in other places in North America, that internet voting does take place and has been taking place at a very small scale. And so it's internet voting. I think with COVID, we've seen and heard a lot more in the press. However, being able to actually speak with a lot of the experts and the technologists and the researchers who are behind the technology, but also on the other side, assessing the risks with internet voting has been quite interesting. And also to see the cross correlation between a lot of the telemetry that we loved for DFIR be integrated into solutions for determining internet voting or SMS-based voting and mobile voting. And hearing and speaking with some of the developers, I'm like, oh yeah, I know about that telemetry. That I used to use it for investigations.
So this is really, really fascinating because for anybody who's familiar with Veronica Schmidt, who is in Norway and originally from South Africa, who's been a guest on the show, but did a presentation at Magnet Virtual Summit, just as you did. You did one on election security. She actually did one on proactive application security and taking to developers the concepts of what needs to be recorded in applications so that an incident response has the data there. So, hey, you've been doing this telemetry for other purposes. What if you bake in the DFIR? And it sounds like you're suggesting the same thing to secure elections. To be honest, I've only internet voted for one thing, and it's the Forensic Forecast Award, right? Not in actual civic elections. I've voted in civic elections every single year since I was 18. It's something I've always taken pride in. And the whole concept that there are elections happening, if we're creating audit trails, it's brilliant. It's like oversimplistically brilliant. So I mean, this sounds exactly how you're applying the lessons that you have from digital forensics to election security. How incredible.
Yeah, I find myself sometimes just really like, wow, no, this makes sense. Whereas even other security experts who aren't necessarily well versed with a lot of the intricacies that we are as forensicators, being able to actually speak to, no, this is, you mean every mobile device has the ability to record this information? You mean your mobile device can tell me how I typically hold my phone and how, someone else who picks up my phone or my children, it records all that? And wait, we can use this for elections because, securing the remote voter or the remote recipient, I mean, there's some telemetry that we can tell things aren't really the user's normal patterns. And so, it's been the cross correlation between DFIR and election security has been really, really eye-opening for me.
I'm gonna point out something that's really, really silly, but you just talked about orientation, and it was something I noticed the other day. I tend to watch video platforms in landscape because I tend to use apps like Hulu and Netflix and occasionally YouTube. My children watch videos in portrait because they use applications like TikTok and other and Musically when it was a thing, and well, before it became TikTok. But the whole point is that their application usage by generation is actually different in the orientation. And you're right, on an iPhone I have a landscape and portrait direct listing of everything, as long as I've got that full file system. So that's pretty cool. I thought of that. I love that. I love it. It's kind of cool when you see other sections of security come together, and it really speaks to the importance of intersectionality and diverse skill sets on teams that are making decisions. Having you as a digital forensicator background working on this team for election security probably brings benefits they would have never realized.
Yeah, every day it's really, and I learn from them, they learn from me. It's give and take.
That's what it's all about, right? Like learning and exposing and growing because of differential backgrounds. Speaking of backgrounds, you do have the most intriguing background. I'd love to know if you have a story from the field you could share with us that's impacted you.
Yeah, absolutely. I really think, my time certainly in the FBI responding to many critical incidents, both domestically and internationally, digital forensics, the importance of digital investigations is crucial to every investigation in the 21st century. But certainly I'd say one that stood out for me the most was supporting the WannaCry ransomware investigation. At the time, in the earlier days of ransomware, the USG and specifically the FBI in their current role isn't necessarily to be the people, the firefighters, the incident responders. Right. Just overall, the FBI plays a more strategic, investigative responsibility as it relates to this. And so WannaCry, for those of you who remember, early, predated my time even in the FBI. And really to be a part of collecting, preserving that digital evidence, which ultimately went into the prosecution while I was in a part of the FBI, and being able to investigate and collect the digital evidence from patient zero, and for it to still have been preserved after all the time that had taken place was something for me. Which was really, really, humbling experience, which then I got to pivot into more private sector digital forensic and incident response, where I was some days dealing with ransomware incidents, 24/7.
So it's really interesting because a lot of times people don't realize that law enforcement examiners do get to deal with incident analysis and things like malware. And it seems like that really made that transition, the experience on that particular case made that transition much smoother for you, as opposed to looking at more common terrorism cases or homicide cases, et cetera. Which really brings me to your unique experience, right? Your unique experiences, I feel like you've worked the four major sectors there are. You've done law enforcement, you've done academia, both pursuing a PhD and being a graduate school professor. You've worked in the private sector doing large-scale IR, working as a virtual CISO with Unit 42 Palo Alto, and now you're in the nonprofit sector. What do you see as the main differences between those environments? How's your experience in those sectors informed your work in each other's sectors? And how, I think a lot of people, as they transition and move, that is something that's very scary for them, people who retire from law enforcement and are looking to move. So I would just love to hear your thoughts about being someone who has transitioned seamlessly between four very different sectors, or maybe we just perceive them differently.
Yeah, I think we ultimately do. And it's funny, I recently did an interview with a journalist and, looked through my background and said, wow, like you haven't been working in election security for a long time. But, I see this other part. Was it really a hard transition? And I really pointed out kind of the similarities between the two.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I've noticed, transitioning from government to private sector, still in academia and now in nonprofit is that customer service and that ability to articulate technical jargon to non-technical people in layman's terms. And so when I was in the government, both at the U.S. Department of State and the FBI, I was articulating whether it to be diplomats, administrators, special agents, intelligence analysts who don't understand the ones and zeros, the binary that we love to dig into, and we can get really nerdy, but being able to articulate in a meaningful way that a jury could understand is ultimately what I found the common similarity, right? When I went over to CRIPSIS Unit 42, Palo Alto, it was victim organizations, it was the board, it was the C-suite, right? And again, it's still being able to bridge that gap between what I've done, because it's really great. Like, just like yourself, Jessica, I'm super technical. I really love getting into new things. And like I did at Magnet Virtual Summit last year, really dug into, jailbreaking and all things check brain, checkmate when it first came out. But that's all good and well. We need to figure out a way to transition all the great work that we're doing, the research we're doing, to non-technical people.
So it's really interesting because I'm going to contrast that to your presentation this year, because obviously I watched both, and you were talking about global election security and the DFIR role, and you presented this rice chart. And you explained where each person's role is, and it was a much different level talk, but I think equally important and equally valuable. I couldn't agree more. In my experience, I've done everything from briefing generals and of foreign countries to executives to general counsel, and it is about the ability to articulate the technical to laymen, to people who were to analysts, and I think you're to students. Students are another group, right? And I think you're right. I think being able to take that same content and being able to articulate it and deliver it to a variety of people is probably one of the most valuable skills you can have as an InfoSec professional. And it's okay if you don't. I want to be clear. It's okay if you don't, because we need people who can spend times in the weeds. But there is definitely a need for people who can articulate those things, both orally as well as in writing. And those are such critical skills, and they're harder skills to teach. It's much easier for me to teach you how to convert binary to hex than it is for me to teach you how to brief a general, but it's still teachable. It's still something that's mentorable. I'd say that's an area where a mentor outside of your organization could be extremely valuable in helping you prepare content and just doing it. I have an adage, and I think you live by this too, and it's if you know your content, you can brief it in 5 minutes, 5 hours, or 5 days, because you should be able to go through that entire depth of technicality, but also depending on the audience. And you really have to know something well to be able to deal with that, and you know your topics well, and that's why you're able to do that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, you hit it right on the nail in terms of just that, right? Knowing your audience, being able to relate to your audience, right? And so I think, when I speak about the RACI, when I was an analyst or, doing forensics at the FBI, I didn't necessarily care about the RACI. However, my bosses certainly did.
Absolutely.
My bosses certainly did. And knowing what I know now, I think it's really just speaking. What's the lingo, right? What is the soup bowl, the acronym of my target audience, and let's speak their language. Whether it's in at CRIPSIS, it was the business language or the legal language when you're dealing with general counsels or breach coaches. And now, like you said, in your experience, briefing generals. Now I brief the head of electoral commissions in foreign governments. And other political appointees, whether it's here domestically or internationally, about this phenomenon of elections and technology.
I love this comment you brought up about language. I find that for the same moniker, I will use a different, like for the same exact type of identifier or artifact or attribute, I will change the word I use depending on the audience, right? And I don't think people necessarily realize the importance and the value of speaking the language of the person you're speaking to. Maybe not literal language. We've all worked with interpreters. I'm sure you have as well. Not everyone, but you and I think, have had that experience working with interpreters. But I think there's definitely something right about how do you speak when it's how do you speak to a jury versus how do you speak to an executive versus how do you, and it can be the same exact ideal on the same case. You look at something like the ransomware case you referenced, that went before a jury, it went before the press, it went before organizations that were affected in the C-suite. So it went before foreign governments, it went before all of those different audiences. What is your main concept there when you're trying to translate the same topic to a variety of audiences? And what do you do when you don't know who your audience is? I've written those reports and I don't know who they're going to.
You brought up 2 points, and I'm going to address the second first and then get back to the first about how do you address an audience that you're not sure about. That has been difficult, right? I think this is where something that I've learned over the career of my career in taking constructive criticism very well, and being humble, right? Just understanding that, I remember my first time working with, I was very seasoned with working with U.S. attorneys, and working with breach counsel or coaches was totally different, right? Both lawyers. Some of them went to some of the same schools, but however, I really being able to understand and learn from them, and in some cases, being able to tell them, hey, how would you best like me to articulate this, right? Or how do you prefer? What's your preferred method? And in some cases, you're writing things and you don't necessarily know the audience, but really trying to do my due diligence, right? So you mentioned OSINT, try to do some OSINT where possible. There's been a lot of that in terms of, just written and oral. And sometimes you're not able to find a whole lot. And so you're really guessing, and sometimes you get it right and sometimes you don't necessarily get it right. And, so that's really where I have, tried to do when it comes to addressing things that I'm not necessarily sure about. However, like I said, having that humility and being able to say, hey, I really missed the mark on this one. I'm going to go back and do some research and get back to you. So,
you brought up a really cool, interesting point there about how sometimes we'll go with the information we have and still make mistakes. You gave this example that was brilliant just there about you were used to briefing attorneys who were prosecutors and worked for the state, and then you had to brief general counsels in corporations. And sometimes you may be doing that OSINT and be like, oh, he graduated from William and Mary, or she graduated from William and Mary. I worked with a state's attorney who was also a William and Mary graduate. I think I know how they, but no, that career experience in the corporate sector has also formed them, or that career in doing prosecutorial work or working for the state or working for the DOJ has really formed them, etc. And so it's really interesting how sometimes this goes back to bias. We introduce bias from knowledge based on our past experiences, and sometimes, like you said, have to humble ourselves and try a different way. I find sometimes you have to have more than one way to explain it in your pocket, because it's something you got to be ready to pivot, right? And you're right, you got to humble and go in that moment. I would say it's a lot harder virtually. Like there's so much of that in person that we used to read off of faces and body language. And right now, if you're just looking at a bunch of squares with just an initial in it, oh my gosh, it is so difficult to know if the message is being conveyed and received. Oh, so what are you doing when you're not making elections secure or teaching? I mean, you just finished your PhD. You must have all this free time now. I joke because, like, as if having 2 jobs isn't enough, a career in academia and a career in the nonprofit sector. But what are you doing when you aren't working on something?
Yeah, no, in non-COVID times, I usually, you could find me in your closest airport, either Centuro Lounge, or for those of you who are, love Priority Pass and things. And so you usually would see me transit in through an airport. So I'm looking forward to responsibly getting back to doing some of that here, as well as in a previous life, I flew drones. And so I had a unmanned aircraft system that I've had for quite some time. And so looking forward to getting back into that. And it's really like an adult remote controlled car.
Absolutely.
You got to factor in a lot more things like wind and all the fun stuff that I learned while I was going for my Part 107 license. But yes, I'm looking forward to getting back to travel and flying my drone some more.
So I love that both here are flight related. You like flying in planes and going to destinations and flying your drones, which brings me to an important question. Have you extracted yet the data off of one of your drones?
I have really, really great research that was done probably, I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago by VTO Labs.
Absolutely.
And I'm sure I actually think you may have put me onto that. I'm probably sure you did. And so, yes, I have extracted data from my drone. I did like a pop-up class one semester a couple years ago using that data. And it's
awesome.
really interesting. It's really interesting to see the forensic data that we get off of that, off of unmanned aircraft systems and all the fun that goes with all things security and digital forensics of drones. So
I worked some cases with some drones before, so it's very interesting to me. If anybody's interested in that drone stuff that was just being mentioned, Steve Watson of VTO Labs, prior Cash Up guest, he did a project with DHS, and actually all of the images and documentation from that project are actually posted on the NIST CFRED site. So on the Computer Forensics Reference Data Set, if anybody wants to play with the data and see what's there, it's insane. There's so much data. That's really, really cool. I wish you would check out the other two sides of planes there, either building and fixing them, like physical planes. You're talking to a former avionicsman myself, or I could see you going for a pilot's license for some reason.
Yeah, I could too. I've been infatuated with planes since I was younger, so I could too.
I mean, I could nerd out with you about how fuel systems work on jets and how vertical takeoff works. I'm a big fan of the JSF because I used to work on the Harrier. So it's fascinating. We should nerd out about that sometime. Not here though. So, because it is so vertical short takeoff and lift up. Sure, it is so cool. And if you're all into the aerodynamics of dealing with your drones and going up that way, when you apply that to nozzle position and flap position, it's so cool. Anyhow, so, one of the other cool things about what you do is you do work with students as well as folks who are at varying levels of their career professionally. What's your advice to those who are looking to break into digital forensics or even broader InfoSec?
Yeah, I think those who are looking to break into InfoSec or DFIR in general, I'd say think about a niche area that you are passionate about, whether it's mobile, whether it's cloud, and really try to gain what it is that you either want to change or fix or contribute to the overall research of, because it's an iterative process, right? Forensics that we were doing 5 years ago is outdated now.
Absolutely.
And so people always say, well, what area, right? And I said, really get a great base level understanding of whether it's InfoSec, whether it's DFIR, but then find that area, whether it's an emerging technology, because really that's the future. I remember, my time in the FBI, we weren't even thinking about doing cloud forensics. Well, I'll tell you right now, every police department, every federal agency around the world has to now do cloud-based forensics, cloud-based investigations, because less of our artifacts, less of the data that we were used to collecting is being held on physical devices anymore. And so that's really where I see, you know, some folks that were the importance and the basics are very important, but really also thinking about, okay, what's next? How can we innovate? How can we get ready for the next challenges? Whether it be a DFIR or InfoSec, if you're doing something more on the governance, risk, and compliance side, is really thinking about the future while still maintaining your level of knowledge and expertise today.
You know, it's such a good point in what you're saying in terms of emerging technology, because so much we learn about that is as a user. You want to prove to yourself that data is mostly in the cloud and not on device anymore? I challenge you to put your device into airplane mode and see what apps you can access your data in. If you can't access it locally, guess why? It's because it needs an internet connection because it's cloud stored. That's going to tell you it right there in a matter of seconds, right? And it also, just from a forensic investigation perspective, tells you which way to look for the data first, right? Like, I'm going to look for an API first if I'm not getting anything while I throw that app on my test phone. I know that in minutes. I don't even have to recover the data off the phone to know that, you know, or if you're seeing all the data, guess what? It's stored on the device. It's a really binary decision. But just looking at the things around you, you can find areas to explore. Like, just look in your office, look in your room, look in your dorm room. You know, you're so right. Just look at the emerging technology and pick something and dig into. And I think what you said there is really key. Like, have a wide understanding, but then pick something and go for it. And I think the key there is you might not wind up working in that thing, but all you have to demonstrate is technical depth.
That's it.
Right?
That is it.
Like you're not doing the same job you were 10 years ago. I'm not doing the same job I was 10 years ago. But the ability to adapt and work with new technology is more important than the tech itself, because that tech isn't going to be the same in 2, 3, 4, 5 years. So that's okay.
Yeah.
And, you know, you become that it person. If you research something new, you're that it person who people are going to go to. You're making a name for yourself and you're providing value to community. I love it. Excellent advice. Excellent advice. Thank you so much, Stephen. It's always a pleasure to get to talk to you. You are doing such incredible things. Thank you so much for making elections safer. And talk about someone who is on the cusp of the newest technologies and thinking how to apply our field. I'm just always blown away by your work. You're always on the bleeding edge. And just thank you for all you do and give back to society as well as digital forensics. Before we go, I want to ask you one question actually about that. Would you speak a little bit to your involvement in community projects like the Cyber Investigation Analysis Standard Expression, and to your involvement with groups like Cyber Sleuth Labs, where you see the value of that and how you see the future going with those things?
Yeah, no, I think UCO and certainly, and I know Daryl, she was a previous guest of Cash Up. You know, giving back is something, you talk about my free time now that I'm not in school, is something where I'm going to be doing much more of. I think there are many people who, you know, either look like me or don't look like me that aren't necessarily sure where they could potentially fit into this industry or other industries. And so through things like the Cyber Sleuth, you know, I look to doing a lot more evangelism of, you know, just kind of my story. You know, like I said, you know, I didn't really get into this, you know, with a lot of computers around me necessarily per se, but it was really just, you know, mentorship and leadership of people around me and being able to network. And so UCO, I really, you know, overall information sharing and sharing of data is vital. It's key. I mean, I think we've all heard about it for DFIR and the InfoSec community for years, but we've had some challenges from a technical perspective, and UCO and the work that UCO is doing in order to bridge that gap, to be able to talk to, we talk about DFIR, but there are sometimes in some organizations, there's a slash between DF and IR. And I think removing, I think UCO has the potential and the ability to remove that. And so we can actually be DFIR as a whole, and some other more community initiatives like the Black Cybersecurity Alliance and Black Cybersecurity Association that I'm looking to volunteer with and give some time.
That Excellent. I appreciate you giving back in those ways. For people who aren't familiar, the Unified Cyber Ontology is a way of defining characteristics in the cyber and IR space in case the Cyber Investigation Analysis Standard Expression is a way of defining them in digital forensics. And both platforms are working together to make common definitions of attributes and artifacts. And just because we have had Daryl on and we've talked about Cyber Sleuth Labs, but we haven't talked about UCO case. And I love that you're really taking on the onus of representation matters. It's something that I really feel strongly about as well. And it's just awesome when people can be public and show the work that they're doing to inspire others. And if there's one thing you're an inspiration to everyone. Constant reminder to me that I need to get off my butt and do my PhD at some point, but that's a whole nother story. So bravo to you, just fantabulous. And again, congratulations on your graduation, Dr. Boyce. Just totally admirable. Love the topic of your dissertation. Thank you for all you do for the community, and just a pleasure to have you on today.
Thank you so much, Jessica.
Thanks everyone for joining us. If you want to catch other episodes of Cash Up, check out magnetforensics.com/cash-up. You'll find links to upcoming episodes as well as all of our prior 50+ episodes and a link to the RSS feed and playlist. Have a great day. Thanks. Bye.